The story. 1. The Vanishing Cabin, a winter's haunting, a scary camping story. Subscribe to Another World for great stories to relax, study, or just enjoy. It was the winter of 1994, the kind of winter that felt endless, like the earth itself had forgotten how to be warm. The snow had been falling steadily for days, a thick, relentless blanket that muffled every sound and turned the world into a quiet white wasteland. My brothers, Tom and Eddie, and I were staying at our Uncle Ron's cabin in the woods, not far from the small town where we grew up. Our parents had left for the weekend, entrusting us to Uncle Ron's care, as they often did when they needed a break. Uncle Ron was the kind of man who seemed perfectly content in solitude. He never married, never had kids, but he loved us in his own quiet, awkward way. He wasn't the sort of guy who talked much, but he always made sure we were fed, entertained, and, most importantly, safe. That weekend, though, safety felt like an abstract concept, something we'd taken for granted, something that slipped away as the night wore on. It was a Friday night, and the snowstorm outside had become a near whiteout. Uncle Ron had let us stay up late to watch Titanic on the VCR. We were all huddled under blankets, the warmth of the fire flickering in the stone fireplace. Outside, the wind howled, but inside, it was calm, the movie droning on as we watched the tragedy unfold on the screen. At some point, the power flickered, and everything went dark for a moment. We all groaned, expecting the worst, but it was only temporary. The lights came back on, and the VCR resumed playing where it left off. Uncle Ron had fallen asleep in his recliner, snoring softly, his face illuminated by the glow of the TV. It was then that Eddie, the youngest of us, got up to use the bathroom. We barely noticed him leave, too engrossed in the movie. A few minutes later, though, he came back, his face pale, his eyes wide with excitement and fear. "You guys," he whispered, his breath coming out in little clouds of mist. "You've got to see this." Tom and I exchanged glances, curious but skeptical. Eddie was always the adventurous one, the kid who could find excitement in the most mundane things. But there was something in his voice that made us pay attention. "What is it?" Tom asked, his voice low to avoid waking Uncle Ron. "Just come," Eddie urged. "Hurry." We followed him to the back door of the cabin, where the snow had piled up so high against the glass that it was hard to see outside. Eddie pointed to the door, and then to the snow just beyond it. "Look," he whispered. There, in the fresh snow, were footprints. They started at the back door, leading away toward the woods that stretched out behind Uncle Ron's property. The prints were deep, the kind you make when you're walking slowly and deliberately through heavy snow. "Whose are those?" Tom asked, his voice a little shaky. Eddie shrugged. "I don't know, but I heard the door handle turn a few minutes ago. I thought it was one of you messing with me, but when I looked out, I saw these." A shiver ran down my spine. The snow was falling too heavily for anyone to be out there without a good reason. We were miles from town, and no one, except for us and Uncle Ron, was supposed to be anywhere near the cabin. "We should wake up Uncle Ron," I said, but Tom shook his head. "Let's just see where they go first," he suggested. "Come on, we'll just follow them a little way. We'll be back before he even wakes up." I hesitated. The idea of stepping out into that cold, snowy night didn't appeal to me, but curiosity tugged at me. There was something eerie about those footprints, something that felt like a mystery we needed to solve. "Fine," I muttered, "but just for a minute." We bundled up in our coats and boots, quietly so as not to disturb Uncle Ron, and slipped out the back door into the freezing night. The snow was still coming down in thick, heavy flakes, covering the tracks quickly. We hurried to follow them before they disappeared altogether. The footprints led toward the woods, and as we got closer, we realized just how deep they were. Whoever had made them was heavy, heavier than any of us, and the prints were fresh. The snow hadn't filled them in much yet. "Who would be out here in this storm?" Eddie whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Maybe a hunter?" Tom suggested, though even he didn't sound convinced. Hunting in a storm like this would be madness. We followed the tracks deeper into the woods, the trees pressing in on us, their branches heavy with snow. The deeper we went, the darker it got, until the light from the cabin was just a distant glow behind us. The footprints were still there, leading us onward. And then we saw it. A cabin. It was small and dark, almost hidden among the trees, its roof sagging under the weight of the snow. There were no lights inside, no signs of life, but the footprints led right to the front door. "Who lives out here?" Eddie asked, his voice trembling. "No one," Tom replied. "At least, not anymore. Uncle Ron told me this part of the woods has been empty for years." We stood there for a moment, staring at the cabin. Something about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong there. It was too quiet, too still. "Let's go," I whispered, the fear starting to creep into my voice. But before we could turn back, there was a sound, a thump, then another, something moving inside the cabin. The noise was faint, but unmistakable. Eddie took a step forward toward the window, peering inside. "I can't see anything," he said. "It's too dark." Suddenly, a loud thump echoed from inside, followed by the sound of something sliding across the floor. We froze, our breath catching in our throats. Then, in the window closest to us, something moved. It was a face, just a glimpse. A pale, featureless face peering out from the darkness, staring right at us. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The face had no eyes, no mouth, just a blank white surface that seemed to pulse with a strange, otherworldly energy. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, swallowed by the shadows inside the cabin. Eddie screamed, and we all bolted, running as fast as we could back toward Uncle Ron's cabin. The snow was deeper now, slowing us down, but fear gave us speed. We didn't look back, didn't stop until we were inside, slamming the door shut behind us, panting and trembling. "What was that?" Tom gasped, his face pale. "I don't know," I replied, my heart racing. "But we're not going back out there." We huddled together in the living room, not saying a word, waiting for Uncle Ron to wake up. When he finally did, we told him everything, about the footprints, the cabin, the face in the window. But when we went back out the next morning to show him, the cabin was gone. We searched for hours, retracing our steps, but the cabin had vanished without a trace. Even the footprints were gone, buried under the fresh snow. Uncle Ron didn't believe us, of course. He thought we'd let our imaginations get the better of us, that we'd seen something in the snowstorm and mistaken it for something more sinister. But we knew what we saw. Years later, we tried to find the cabin again. We searched the woods, combed through old maps, even looked on Google Earth. But there was nothing. No sign of the cabin, no record of anyone ever living out there. It was as if the cabin had never existed. But I know it was real. And sometimes, on cold winter nights, when the snow is falling heavy and the world feels quiet and still, I wonder if it's still out there, hidden deep in the woods, waiting for someone else to find it, or if it's waiting for us to come back. The Story 2. The Haunting at Creighton Lake. The thing about the woods is that they're never truly silent, not really. Even on the calmest night, when the wind is still and the animals are nestled in their burrows, there's always something. The creak of a tree branch, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of leaves underfoot. It's that kind of low hum, that background noise of nature that makes you forget how isolated you truly are out there. At least, that's what I told myself as I zipped up my tent on that cold October night. We'd come to Lake Creighton to escape the monotony of city life for a few days. Me, Sam, and Jack. We'd known each other since high school, gone through the usual post-college drifting apart, and now, pushing 30, we tried to make time for each other once or twice a year. This trip was Sam's idea. He'd found the lake on some camping blog, raved about how peaceful it was, how perfect the fishing would be. Jack and I were less enthusiastic. Sure, we liked the outdoors, but Sam had a way of getting a little too excited about these things, and that excitement often led us into situations we'd regret. The lake was about 2 hours out of town, surrounded by dense forest with nothing but a few narrow trails cutting through the trees. When we arrived that afternoon, the sun was still high, casting long golden beams across the water. It was beautiful, I had to admit, the kind of place that felt untouched, forgotten by time. We set up camp near the shore, close enough to hear the gentle lap of the water, but far enough that the bugs wouldn't be unbearable. The three of us sat around a small fire, cracking open beers and talking about everything and nothing. It felt good to be away from the noise of the world. As night fell, the lake took on a different character. The breeze that had been so pleasant in the afternoon turned cold, sending ripples across the water's surface. The trees, which had seemed so welcoming, now loomed over us, their branches like skeletal hands against the darkening sky. We hadn't seen another soul all day, and now, as the last light faded, it felt like we were the only people left on Earth. Around 9:01 p.m., we were sitting by the fire, half drunk, and lazily chatting, when Sam suddenly stopped mid-sentence. His ears narrowed, and he held up a hand to silence use. "Do you guys see that?" he whispered. Jack and I turned to look at the lake, following Sam's gaze. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just the smooth, inky blackness of the water, broken only by the faint reflection of the moon. But then I noticed it. A ripple, subtle but unmistakable, moving slowly across the surface. It was the kind of ripple you'd expect if someone had just thrown a stone into the water, but none of us had moved. "There's something in the water," Sam said, his voice barely above a whisper. I squinted, trying to make out what he was seeing. There was definitely something moving out there, but it was too far away to tell what it was. Could have been a fish, I thought, maybe a beaver. But there was something about the way the water was disturbed, something deliberate, almost like it was being pushed aside by something large and unseen. "Probably just a fish," I said, trying to sound casual, though I didn't believe it. Jack shook his head. "Nah, that's too big for a fish. Maybe a deer wading through." "Deer don't swim, man," Sam replied. He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the lake. "Turn off the speaker." We'd been playing music on a small Bluetooth speaker, but I reached over and switched it off. The sudden silence was jarring, amplifying the sound of the water lapping against the shore. The ripple was closer now, moving steadily toward us. None of us spoke, our eyes glued to the water. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, a primal warning from some long-forgotten part of my brain. Sam stood up, his hand moving toward his flashlight, but before he could grab it, the ripple stopped. Just like that, the water went still, as if nothing had ever been there. "See? It's nothing," Jack said, though his voice lacked the usual bravado. Sam hesitated, then sat back down, but his eyes never left the lake. We all sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind rustling through the trees, the occasional crackle of the fire. After about an hour, when nothing else happened, we convinced ourselves it was just our imaginations playing tricks on us. We went back to our beers, though the conversation was more subdued. Eventually, the cold and the alcohol got to us, and we decided to call it a night. Sam and Jack shared one tent, and I took the other. As I zipped up my sleeping bag, I tried to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in my gut. The ripple had been strange, sure, but there was probably a logical explanation. Maybe it had been an animal after all. Still, I found it hard to fall asleep. I don't know how long I had been out when I woke up. At first, I thought it was the cold that had roused me. The temperature had dropped sharply, and I could see my breath hanging in the air. But then I heard it. Footsteps. They were faint at first, almost too soft to hear, but unmistakable. Something, or someone, was walking outside my tent, the snow crunching underfoot. My heart began to race as I strained to listen. The steps were slow, deliberate, like whoever, or whatever, was out there, was trying not to be heard. I held my breath, my ears ringing in the silence. The footsteps were getting closer, moving around the campsite. I thought about calling out to Sam and Jack, but something stopped me. It was the same feeling you get when you hear a noise in the middle of the night and convince yourself it's nothing, even though you know it's something. Some instinct told me to stay quiet, to wait. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I felt my entire body go rigid. Whoever was out there was standing just a few feet away, separated from me only by the thin nylon walls of the tent. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I didn't dare move. Then, without warning, a scream pierced the night. It was loud, shrill, and utterly inhuman, a sound so full of pain and terror that it seemed to freeze the air itself. It went on for several agonizing seconds before cutting off abruptly, leaving only the ringing silence in its wake. I couldn't tell if it had been a man or a woman. Hell, I couldn't even tell if it had been human. For a moment, I was paralyzed, unsure of what to do. Then I heard the sound of a tent zipper being pulled open, followed by the sound of running footsteps. Sam's voice cut through the night, frantic and terrified. "Get to the car! Now!" I scrambled out of my sleeping bag, fumbling with the zipper of my tent, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get it open. I grabbed my jacket and my flashlight, then bolted out into the freezing night. The campsite was in chaos. Sam and Jack were already running toward the car, their faces pale with fear. I didn't stop to grab anything else. I just ran. The scream echoed in my head as I sprinted toward the car, my feet slipping on the snow-covered ground. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. What had made that sound? What had been walking around our campsite? When I reached the car, Sam was already in the driver's seat, the engine running. Jack was in the back, his hands shaking as he fumbled with his seatbelt. I threw myself into the passenger seat, slamming the door behind me. "Go! Go!" I shouted, and Sam floored the gas pedal. The tires spun in the snow for a moment before catching, and we tore down the narrow dirt road that led out of the woods. No one spoke. We didn't look back. We just drove. It wasn't until we were miles away, the forest far behind us, that Sam finally slowed down. The car was silent except for the sound of our ragged breathing. I glanced over at Sam. His face was pale, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "What the hell was that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Sam shook his head. "I don't know. I don't want to know." We drove in silence for the rest of the night, too afraid to stop, too afraid to talk about what had happened. When the sun finally rose, we were hours from the lake, miles from the nightmare we had left behind. The next morning, we went back. We had to. Our gear was still there, and we needed to know if it had all been some kind of strange dream, a collective hallucination brought on by the cold and the isolation. But when we arrived, everything was as we had left it. The tents were still standing. The fire pit was cold and empty. There was no sign of anyone, or anything, having been there during the night. It was as if nothing had happened. But we knew better. We packed up in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. None of us wanted to admit it, but we all knew the truth. Something had been there that night, something that didn't belong. As we drove away for the last time, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't escaped, that whatever had been in the lake, whatever had walked through our campsite, was still out there, watching, waiting. And I knew one thing for sure: I was never going back. The story 3. The Watcher in the Woods. The sky above the forest was a muted gray, the kind of sky that promised rain but never delivered it in torrents, just a light drizzle that would soak you through over time if you didn't keep moving. I had been out there for hours, the soles of my boots caked in wet dirt and leaves, my camera slung over my shoulder, occasionally snapping pictures of the woodland drenched in mist. This was my job, my life, capturing the world when it was at its most serene, its most vulnerable. But today, the forest felt different. It felt off. It had been a long time since I'd felt uneasy while out on a shoot. I'd spent years wandering through places just like this, remote, quiet, untouched. There was something comforting about the isolation, the way the world fell away and left you alone with your thoughts and the sound of your own breath. But today, in the endless sprawl of towering trees and shifting shadows, there was a feeling creeping over me, a sense that I was not as alone as I thought. I'd been walking for hours, following a winding path deeper and deeper into the forest, my head down, focused on the shots I wanted to capture, the way the rain glistened on the leaves, the way the mist curled through the trees, the play of light and shadow as the afternoon faded into early evening. I wasn't paying attention to where I was going, and by the time I stopped to take in my surroundings, I realized I had no idea how far I had wandered. My car was somewhere back the way I had come, but I had no clear sense of direction anymore. That was when I first heard it. A soft crunch, like someone stepping on a twig or shifting through the underbrush. I froze, my ears straining to catch the sound again. The forest was quiet, save for the steady drip of rain from the tree branches overhead. I scanned the area around me, my eyes searching the gloom for movement, but there was nothing. Just trees and shadows, the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. I shook my head, telling myself it was just a deer or maybe a raccoon. These woods were full of wildlife after all. I had encountered all kinds of creatures on my shoots, and they usually wanted nothing to do with me. Still, there was a tightness in my chest, a gnawing sensation in my gut that I couldn't shake. I kept walking, this time more slowly, more deliberately. I needed to find my way back to the trail. If I could just retrace my steps, I'd be fine. It wasn't that late yet. I had time. But then I heard it again. A soft footfall, closer this time. Then another. The unmistakable sound of someone, or something, walking in the woods, matching my pace. I stopped again, turning around, expecting to see an animal dart across my path, or maybe a hiker who had somehow snuck up on me. But the space behind me was empty. Nothing but the thick trunks of the trees and the gathering gloom of dusk. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. No answer. The sound stopped as soon as I spoke, as if whoever, or whatever, was out there was deliberately avoiding being seen. My pulse quickened, my hand instinctively tightening around the camera strap on my shoulder. I told myself it was nothing, that my mind was playing tricks on me. It was easy to let your imagination run wild when you were alone in the woods. But then I heard it again. This time, it was unmistakable. A footstep, slow and deliberate, followed by another. The sound was too rhythmic to be an animal, too cautious. I turned quickly, my eyes scanning the trees, and that's when I saw it. A figure, half hidden behind one of the massive trunks, watching me. It was only a glimpse, a fleeting moment before it disappeared behind the tree, but it was enough to send a jolt of fear through me. It was a man, or at least, it looked like a man. He was tall, taller than I was at least, and wearing what looked like a dark blue jacket. I hadn't seen his face, just the outline of his body as he ducked out of sight. My heart began to race. Who the hell was that? What was he doing out here? I took a few cautious steps forward, my eyes fixed on the spot where I had seen the figure, but there was no movement. The forest was still again, the only sound the soft patter of rain on the leaves. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. Maybe it was just another hiker, I told myself. Maybe he had seen me first and didn't want to startle me. Or maybe. But even as I tried to convince myself that there was nothing to worry about, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The way he had moved, the way he had disappeared so quickly, it didn't feel right. I turned and started walking faster, my eyes darting from side to side, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. I could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on me, the way the shadows seemed to grow longer, the air colder. And then I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were closer, faster, as if whoever was out there was following me, matching my pace. I broke into a jog, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I just wanted to get out of the woods, back to the safety of my car, back to anywhere that wasn't this place. But no matter how fast I moved, the footsteps kept pace with me. I glanced over my shoulder and there he was again. The man standing just a few feet away now, half hidden behind a tree. This time I saw more of him. He was tall, impossibly tall, his shoulders broad, his body draped in a long dark coat. He was wearing glasses, thick lenses that caught the last light of the setting sun. But it was his face that sent a chill down my spine. His face was expressionless, his features flat and blank, as if he was wearing a mask. There was something wrong about the way he stood, too, something unnatural. His body was stiff, his movements jerky, like a puppet on strings. And he was watching me. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the wet earth, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest blurred around me, the trees and underbrush melding into a dark, impenetrable wall. I didn't know where I was going, but I didn't care. I just had to get away from him. I could hear the footsteps behind me, faster now, matching my own. He was chasing me, closing in on me. I ran harder, faster, pushing myself beyond what I thought I was capable of. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound of the footsteps stopped. I slowed to a stop, my chest heaving, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. I turned around expecting to see the man standing there, just a few feet away, but the forest behind me was empty. No sign of him. I stood there for a moment, my heart still racing, trying to catch my breath. Had I imagined it? Had I let my fear get the best of me? But no. I had seen him. I had heard him. He was real. I started walking again, this time more slowly, more cautiously. I needed to find my way back to the trail, back to my car. The forest was growing darker by the minute, the last light of day fading into the thick canopy overhead. And then I saw him again. This time, he was closer, standing in the middle of the path just ahead of me. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. He just stood there, watching me with those blank, unseeing eyes. I froze, my body trembling, my mind racing. What did he want? Why was he following me? For a long moment, neither of us moved. The rain continued to fall, soft and steady, the only sound in the stillness of the forest. Then, without warning, he took a step forward. I turned and ran again, my legs burning with exhaustion, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the footsteps behind me, faster now, more insistent. He was coming for me. I ran harder than I ever had before, the trees whipping past me, the ground slick and treacherous beneath my feet. I stumbled once, catching myself just before I fell, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The footsteps were right behind me now, so close I could almost feel his breath on the back of my neck. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound of the footsteps stopped. I kept running, not daring to look back, until I burst out of the trees and into the clearing where my car was parked. I threw myself against the door, fumbling with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. I jumped into the driver's seat, slamming the door behind me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I locked the doors, my eyes scanning the trees for any sign of him. But he was gone. The forest was still again. The only sound the soft patter of rain on the roof of my car. I sat there for a long time, my hands trembling, my heart still racing. I didn't know what had just happened, didn't know who or what that man was. But I knew one thing for sure. I had to get out of there. I started the car, the engine roaring to life, and peeled out of the clearing, the tires kicking up mud and leaves as I sped down the narrow dirt road. As I drove, the fear slowly began to ebb, replaced by a cold, gnawing sense of unease. I had gotten away, but the man, whoever he was still out there, watching, waiting. And as I glanced in the rearview mirror, my heart skipped a beat. There, standing at the edge of the trees, just barely visible in the fading light, was the man. He was watching me, and I knew deep down that this wasn't over. Not yet. The Glimmering Woods Terror, a scary camping story. Subscribe to Another World for great videos to relax, study, or just enjoy. The house stood at the edge of the forest like a forgotten relic, isolated in the vast, sprawling wilderness of Tennessee. It was late autumn when we first moved in, and the leaves were thick on the ground, carpeting the forest in shades of red, brown, and gold. My wife Claire was captivated by the place. She had always wanted to live somewhere quiet, somewhere our son, Ethan, could grow up surrounded by nature. So, when the opportunity came to buy a remote property, we jumped on it without much thought. The first few days were peaceful. The hum of the wind through the trees and the soft rustle of the underbrush became a comforting background noise. The silence out here was different, almost alive in a way that felt comforting. But that peace didn't last long. The strangeness started subtly, almost like a whisper at the back of our minds. It began with the dog, Max, a loyal mutt we had rescued years ago. Normally, he loved being outdoors, running through the woods with Ethan or lying in the sun. But now, he refused to go outside once the sun dipped below the horizon. He'd stand by the door, ears flat, tail between his legs, growling softly at the trees. No matter how much I coaxed him, he wouldn't step foot beyond the porch after dark. At first, I thought maybe he had caught wind of a wild animal or something that spooked him, but it didn't stop. Day after day, his reluctance grew worse, and soon he wouldn't go near the woods even during the day. Then came the noises. It was always at night. I would be sitting in the living room, the fire crackling softly in the hearth, while Claire put Ethan to bed upstairs. The nights in the woods were usually full of sound: crickets, owls, and the occasional distant howl of a coyote. But there were moments when the forest would fall completely silent. No wind, no animals, nothing. Just an eerie, heavy quiet that felt wrong. In those moments, I'd hear it. A loud resonant thud, like a large rock being thrown against the ground or a tree nearby. I'd rush outside with a flashlight, expecting to find something, anything. But there was never any sign of what caused the sound. One night, while I was out investigating one of these strange thuds, Claire came running out of the house, panic in her eyes. "Did you hear that?" she asked, breathless. "Hear what?" "Ethan, he's crying. He's in the woods." I froze. "Ethan's in bed, Claire. I just checked on him before coming out here." She shook her head, her voice trembling. "I heard him. I heard him calling for help." I looked back at the house, then at the woods, my stomach twisting. "He's inside, Claire. You were dreaming." But she insisted, and I couldn't shake the look in her eyes. Pure terror, as though something deep within her knew it wasn't just a nightmare. She refused to go back inside until I walked the perimeter of the property, shining the light into the dark, tangled trees. I found nothing, of course. But from that night on, Claire was never the same. She became distant, distracted, always glancing toward the woods as if expecting something to emerge. Then Ethan started acting strange. At first, it was small things. He'd sit by the window, staring out at the trees for hours. When I asked him what he was looking at, he'd point and say, "The man in the woods." My heart would race each time, but when I looked, there was no one there. He started talking to someone that Claire and I couldn't see, always insisting he was talking to him. We thought it was an imaginary friend, just a phase. But the way Ethan described this friend, it didn't feel like the harmless fantasies of a child. "He watches us from the trees," Ethan said one night at dinner. Claire dropped her fork, the clatter echoing in the too-silent room. "He likes when it's quiet." Claire and I exchanged a glance, unease crawling up my spine. "Who is he, Ethan?" Claire asked gently. "The man," Ethan said simply, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. "He's shiny. He glimmers." The word hit me like a punch to the gut. Glimmers. The next night, things escalated. It was late, past midnight, and I was in bed, staring up at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Max had started growling again, his body pressed against the door, hackles raised. He wouldn't leave my side, and his eyes kept darting toward the window. I heard it then, just outside, faint at first but growing louder, panting, like the heavy breathing of something large, something out of sight, pacing just beyond the edge of the porch. I sat up, my pulse hammering in my ears, straining to hear more. The panting continued, louder now, closer. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and walked slowly to the window, heart in my throat. My breath fogged the glass as I peered outside. Nothing. But the panting was there, right outside, even though I couldn't see a thing. Suddenly, Max went silent, his ears perking up. His growl dropped to a low whine and he backed up, slinking toward the bed with his tail between his legs. I froze, gripping the flashlight tightly, the panting still loud in my ears, and then it stopped. The woods went dead silent again, and for a long moment I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The next day, Claire told me she was hearing things too. Voices, soft, distant cries for help, always coming from the woods. But when I went out to check, I couldn't find anyone, no trace of another person anywhere. We were alone. Except, we weren't. It was a few days later when my niece Emma came to visit. She had always loved the outdoors, and we thought her presence might ease the tension that had been growing in the house. She and I decided to take a walk through the woods that afternoon, just to clear our heads. Ethan stayed behind with Claire. The walk was quiet at first, too quiet. The forest felt oppressive, like the trees were closing in around us. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Emma noticed it too. She kept glancing over her shoulder, her brow furrowed. "I don't like it out here," she said softly. "It feels wrong." I nodded. "I know what you mean." We walked a little further when, suddenly, Emma stopped dead in her tracks. I followed her gaze, my heart leaping into my throat. There, just beyond the trees, stood a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, and shimmering like heat waves rising off the pavement on a summer day. Its body was translucent, flickering in and out of sight, and its movements were wrong, unnatural, jerky, like it was glitching. My blood ran cold. The thing stared at us, though I couldn't make out its face, just the vague outline of a humanoid figure. And then, in an instant, it was gone. Emma grabbed my arm, her voice barely above a whisper. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know," I said, my voice shaking. "We need to get back." We rushed back to the house, not daring to look back, but I could feel it. Something was following us, watching us. The air around me felt charged, heavy with dread. When we got back to the house, Claire was waiting at the door, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. "I heard him again," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Ethan, he was calling for me, but he was inside the whole time." That night, the noises in the woods grew louder. The thuds, the strange panting, the eerie silence. And then came the voices. Claire and I both heard them now, faint cries for help, always just out of reach, echoing through the trees. We stopped sleeping. We couldn't. Every time we closed our eyes, we felt it, something lurking just beyond the edge of the darkness. And then, one night, I saw it again. The Glimmer Man. It was standing at the edge of the woods, just beyond the porch, its translucent form flickering in and out of existence. It moved toward me, its jerky, unnatural gait sending waves of terror through my body. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. My feet were frozen to the ground. It was like the thing had some kind of hold on me, pulling me closer with every second. Then, in an instant, it was gone. Just gone. I ran inside, slamming the door behind me, gasping for breath. Claire was sitting in the living room, holding Ethan close, her face pale with fear. "We need to leave," she whispered, her voice trembling. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't bound by the woods. It would follow us, no matter where we went. The Glimmer Man had us, and there was no escape. The next morning, I woke to find Claire staring out the window, her eyes distant, as if she had lost herself in the woods even though she was standing right here.